In this tutorial, we are going to be focusing on Adobe Illustrator. And typically the way you can get to Illustrator, if you're on a Mac or Windows, you can, on the Mac, you can go up and search through here. You could also, in Windows, search on the bottom. Or you can open up the Creative Cloud app and then just click Open on Illustrator. And currently, I'm going to go ahead and show what I'm using. So if we view product details, currently I'm working on version 29.2.1, which is basically Illustrator 2025, maybe. So we're going to go ahead and open this. And Illustrator should pop up. So this tutorial is really just going to start by going over the interface and talk a bit why you use Illustrator versus Photoshop, and what vector artwork is versus raster-based artwork. So the first step is to create a new file. And I'm just going to go with this 1280 by 1280. It doesn't really matter at this point. It's just square. It fits on the screen nicely. I'm going to select that. There's a bunch of options up here. There's things for film and video, just a bunch of different templates and things you can use. But we're just going to go with this. This was a recent one for mine, so you could go to Art and Illustration. And there should be one in here that's 1280 by 1280. If there's not 1280 by 1024, I'm going to go ahead and just use this one for now, just because we're here. But you can see this is in points. If I wanted this in pixels, I can go over here and I can just say pixels. Points are more for print-based media. Pixels are clearly for screen-based media. So I'm going to leave it at pixels because I've chosen that now. The raster effects, color mode, all of that. If we're working for anything screen-based, we want to use RGB color. If we're working for print media, typically we want to use CMYK, just because that's how most printing systems are set up, is to use those four colors. And if you're not familiar, C is cyan, M is magenta, Y is yellow, and then K is black or grayscale. So, and then we could increase the quality of these raster effects. We're going to leave them low for right now because I don't know what computers you're working on, and we just want these things to process quickly and not take forever. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create. Now, the big difference between Illustrator and Photoshop is that Illustrator is a vector-based drawing program, and Photoshop is a raster-based drawing program. And raster-based images are essentially, what that means is when you're working on those, you're actually changing the colors of the individual pixels in the image. Right? Anything you do modifies those colors in some way. And so when you zoom in on a raster-based image, you're going to see you'll see it become pixelized or pixelated. There we go, that's a better word, as you go. Whereas in Illustrator, all you're doing is you're essentially, as you draw, you're creating a set of instructions for the computer to recreate later. And what's nice about that is with vectors and things, you can draw, like, say, a nice smooth, like a circle, and you could print that circle on something as small as a button, or you could print that circle on something as large as a banner that's on the side of a building. And no matter what, you're going to get a nice clean line because it's just an instruction for how to draw this shape. It's not actually going to be pixelating that thing as it goes. So it can be really useful for something you need to scale, or something that's portable between many different devices. It's really great. That's why people use it for drawing logos and doing other things like that, and icons and all of that. Okay. So that's the general reason why we use Illustrator. So let's look at the interface a bit. First, I'm going to close this because it just opened with how things were left. And there may be differences here in what tools you see by default. And that's just because it may be showing me some of the last tools that I used, right? It pays attention to what you use, and then it continues to show you those things. What's nice is with each one of these tools, it actually kind of gives you a little dialog box that shows you what it does. But these are all the tools we use for creating artwork, right? There's a couple in here that are, more specialized, but this is where all the tools for creating artwork exist. This top bar up here is the settings for the individual tool we have selected. Currently, I don't actually have a tool selected, but these are sort of the default things. This first box here is the fill color. This is the stroke color, and then you'll have a stroke, the weight of the stroke, if there's a width profile and what type of brush it is, and you have your opacity, and there's some other settings up here as well. If we look at the other side of the screen, you will see that there are a row of tools here, and these are other quick things that allow you to, say, access the swatches panel, or maybe if once we have some things in here, work on these layers, and this is sort of where all the things you draw are going to be organized. And there's just a couple other settings here, artboards, which we're not going to talk about too much yet, and some other things that just are basically make it kind of quick and easy to get to things. I want you to note that there's these little dashed lines here, and each one of those, and then a hard line at the bottom. That means that these three options are all available under the same heading over here. And then over further, there's the properties and the library and libraries. And we're not going to worry about libraries at all at this point, but we're going to be using properties a fair amount. The other things is there are ways to arrange documents, switch the workplace. Apparently, I'm not quite zoomed out all the way. There we go. And workspaces basically just highlight different tools to do different parts of a project. We're going to be staying with the Essentials Classic. If we switch to Essentials, this may be more what your view is going to show. And so that top bar vanishes. I find that the top bar, especially for teaching, is really useful because it has all of these options up here and they're visible, and it just makes life a lot easier when we're going through teaching the software. Let's start by looking at some of the basic drawing tools and draw our first shapes. So we have up here what's called the pen tool. We have the curvature tool. We have a type tool, line segment, rectangle, brush, etc., etc., etc. And so we're going to start by using some really basic shapes. But I want you to note any of the tools that have a little triangle in the bottom means if you click and hold, it will open up other tools that are under that. Right? So the rectangle tool, and anytime there's a tool with a letter here, that's the shortcut. So if I was to just hit the letter M on the keyboard, it would automatically select the rectangle tool. If I just hit the letter L on the keyboard, it automatically selects the ellipse tool. So let's start by just drawing a rectangle. So we're going to select the rectangle tool, and we come over here and you'll see I get this crosshair. I can just click and drag and release, and now I've got this shape. And now it's currently highlighted in blue, and that's just the indication that this is what's currently selected. I can't, if I click off in space here, right, it's going to allow me to draw another one because I still have the rectangle tool selected. If I go ahead and undo that, so if I'm on a Mac, I can hit Command Z. If I'm on a Windows, it would be Control Z. And then let's say I want to move this or manipulate this in some way. The way that I can do that is I can come over here and I'm going to use the selection tool, right? It's this dark arrow. And the other way to get to the selection tool is the letter V on the keyboard, right? Quick keys are really useful to not have to go back and forth over and over and over again. So, so with this, if I have this just sort of hovering over the fill here, I can drag this object, right, anywhere. And I want you to note, if I go off the artboard, which is what this white rectangle is called here, right, I can still see the artwork completely. I can put it wherever I want it to go. But if I was to go to print this out, the artboard is the only thing that's going to print or be saved as a file. Everything else will be chopped off the edges, unless I tell it to ignore the artboard. Okay, so we've got that. We can move this thing around. I want you to show you some other transform options you've got before we change color and all of that. So if I hover over one of these center marks, I can actually raise or lower this, right? I can adjust it this way. If I go over the corner, right, I can do both dimensions at the same time. If I hold down Shift while I do that, it's going to lock in the proportions that I've got. And so it'll allow me to scale that with proportion. If I hold down Option, it's going to scale around the center point, right? And if I hold down Option and Shift, it'll keep the proportions and scale around that center point. Other things that I can do is, one, I can actually round these corners, right, to a certain point. This is when it hits the final option, so I can get to like a capsule shape with this, right? So I can use this to very quickly round corners. And then if I hover outside the corner a little bit, not on top of it, but outside, I get this little angle thing. And what that allows me to do is if I click and drag, I can rotate this, right? So it allows me to do, I have a lot of ability to manipulate this shape just with these controls that I've got here. So let's go ahead and start looking at some of the tools that are up here in the top row. So first, we've got our fill color. And by default, it opens to the swatches panel, which basically allows you to choose, solid colors, right? I can choose any of these colors, and it's automatically, as long as I have this selected, it's going to adjust the fill, right? Now I want you to note, if I come back over here and I click and I don't have anything selected, and I change the fill color, right, it's not going to update the fill color, right? I need to have this selected. And you'll note when I select it, it's going to jump back to whatever the actual fill is, but then I can go ahead and make that change. Now the next line over is the stroke. And the stroke, you may not actually see anything change here right now, and that's because our stroke is really thin. If I was to go back to that magenta and come out here and deselect, you can see that magenta line around there, but just barely. So now if I select this object and I come over here to stroke, I can either just hit this up arrow to increase the stroke weight point by point, or I can select in this box and I could say, oh, I want this to be 25 points. All right, so now I've got a much thicker stroke on this, and then there's some other things I can do to that stroke. So first, the things that are exposed. One, I can come down here and I can say, oh, I want this to be, maybe I want this width profile to change, right? So I want it to start out small and get larger. There's a couple other default width profiles here. There's actually a tool we'll look at later in a different tutorial that allows you to kind of create your own width profile. But for now, let's stay with uniform. And then under here, there's several different options for brushes. There's the basic, right? There's this charcoal. There's this other like hazy weird one. There's even this patterned brush, which actually allows you to do some really interesting things. But to start with, right, we just have these few options. There's these round, these calligraphic brushes. And we'll look at some other examples here in a minute, but let's go ahead and go back to the basic. And you'll see, because I selected one of these that had like a small number of points, it's gone back to my default stroke weight, which is a little annoying. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this back up to 25. Now, one of the other things that we can set is, I want you to note that any word that has a dashed line under it means there's a menu you can get to by clicking on it. So if I click on my stroke panel, you'll see that what pops up here now is my weight, the type of end cap, which, because this is a closed path, doesn't matter too much, the type of corners that I want, and in this case, a hard mitered joint, right? I can do a bevel, but again, we have these rounded corners here already, so we're not going to notice that. But one of the other things I can do is I can align the stroke in different ways. So I can have the stroke be on the inside of this outside edge. By default, it typically is balanced. It's halfway in, halfway out. I can also have it be completely on the outside. Other settings I've got here is I can make this a dashed line, right? And so now I've got these dashes that are 12 points. And if I don't fill in any of these other fields, then it means that the gap is also 12 points wide, right? So it's even. Let's say I want these dashes to be, let's just say 40 wide, right? And then because I hit enter, it jumped me out of there, so I can just click on that again. But let's say I want the gap to be 20 wide. And then if I just click somewhere else, right, it looks like I have to hit enter for it to take, right? So now I've got, right, this dashed border. That's pretty cool. But let's say I want these to be rounded dashes, right? So this is where the end caps can make a difference. If I click on projecting cap, you're going to notice it basically fills in completely, because what it's doing is it's essentially drawing past the end of each of those segments. If I do a rounded cap, you'll see that, right, I do get these these rounded cap spaces, but they're touching. So let's go ahead and make our gap just a little bit bigger. So we're going to say 30 points, right? And so now I actually have some gaps in there, and I've got this nice dashed line. Okay, so if I go over here to opacity, right, I can adjust the opacity for this entire shape, right? So if this is 100% opacity, right, you'll see that it seems to get less opaque. And one way we can test this is if I select this object and I copy and paste it, I say Command C or Control C and Control V, right? You can see that where they overlap, right, I'm going to get, much more opacity than where they're not overlapping, right? And now that I have these two copies, I could always change one and have it be different colors, right? And you can kind of see how the color blending is happening. Now, one of the other things with this is that I can go ahead and go to opacity, and under opacity, because that has that dashed line on it, I can change my blending mode, much like you can do in Photoshop. I can say, set this to multiply, right? I could set it to screen. There's or overlay. There's all sorts of different ways I can get this object to blend with the colors of the object that's underneath it. I can do difference, which is really kind of strange. Exclusion, which doesn't change much. Hue, and again, I can adjust this opacity independent of the other. Right, with some of these, if I go to 100% opacity, like say even multiply, right, I'm still being able to see the object below it because of how this multiply blend mode works, right? It's basically how should these colors interact with each other when they're overlapping. Okay, so let's look at some of the other drawing tools, right? We've done some of the basics. Under this, there's other shapes we can do. With the polygon tool, the default size, and note whatever my last settings were here are going to transfer. So we've got this nice thing. Oops, hold on a second. Here, and so, right, I can adjust this and do whatever. If I undo that and I click and drag again, but I don't let go yet, and I use the up or down arrow, I can adjust the number of sides on this object. Right, so I can go, and you can go all the way up so it looks like a smooth circle, however many sides that is, with the scale that I'm working at. But right, so if I want a pentagon or a rectangle again or a triangle, right, this is the way that I can very quickly make these uniform polygonal shapes. If I have this tool selected, and you'll note I have a crosshair here, if I just click in space, I can open up this little dialog that asks what radius I want this to be and how many sides I want. So I could say, I want this to have 3 sides and I want it to be, 400, the radius to be 400. And when I click on that, it's going to go ahead and create a circle or a triangle for me that is that dimensions. And I want you to note that whether I'm in this tool, right, I can actually round those corners pretty quickly. And note it just has one corner that has the thing because they all act uniformly. I can also use the selection tool to do the same thing. But again, right now I could scale this in all sorts of different ways. And I want you to note that the stroke weight, right, scales with the object. So it's getting smaller or larger based on how I'm scaling this object. Okay, so you can play with ellipses and the star tool and the flare tool and any of that. And note there is a rounded rectangle tool, but again, you can do your own rounding. You don't even really need that tool any longer. Let's look at some of the other drawing tools, because we don't always just want to make triangles, rectangles, ellipses, and other shapes like that. We want to be able to make much more varied forms. So I'm just going to move some of this stuff out of the way for the time being. And with nothing selected, I just clicked once in emptiness. I'm going to go ahead and change, at least change the stroke to not be dashed any longer, but I'll leave everything else more or less the same. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use the pen tool and the curvature tool. So the pen tool is the classic tool that's been used forever to draw curves and more complex shapes. If you haven't used a Bezier drawing tool previously, it's going to be a little weird, but you can kind of see even in this dialog what sort of things happen. And so let's go ahead and try, and we're going to draw a cloud with this. And so to start with, before we draw that cloud, just a little overview of how this tool works. So first, if I just click once, it creates a point. If I just click again, it's going to create a line segment between 2 points. If I click again, it will create another line segment between those 2 points. And I want you to note that, right, it's automatically filling this shape. Basically, it's going between the 2 open ends and creating the shortest possible path, right? So if I was to actually come up here and create another point here, you can see, right, again, it's going the shortest possible path between those 2 points. And so it's creating that fill there. I'm going to go ahead and undo that last point, because what I want to do is I kind of want to go ahead and click a few more times. And now I want to close this shape, and to close it, I can come up here, you'll get that little circle icon that shows up, and then I click it and this shape is closed. Now, right, I can move this shape around, I could adjust the stroke, the weight, like all of those other settings, I can rotate it, I can do all the same things that I could do with any other shape. But the pen tool doesn't just draw straight lines, it also draws curves. So to draw a curve with the pen tool, we're going to select the pen tool. By the way, the letter P is the shortcut for pen. And so what I can do is I can click, and I'm just going to create a single point there, right? So now I've got this hard line, and then to create a curve, I click and drag, right? And you'll see these 2 bars here, those are called handles. And what that allows you to do is, once we get to the next step, it's going to allow you to further manipulate the curve, right? One of the beautiful things about Illustrator is that nothing is permanent, more or less, right? I can set these curves like this, and now what I'm going to do is, instead of clicking and dragging on this point, I'm just going to click, right? So I can do a straight line across the bottom, right? So now I've got this mix of like a hard corner, I've got some soft curves. And one of the other things with the pen tool, when the pen tool has this asterisk icon next to it, that means you're going to be creating a new path if you start drawing again. However, if I hover over this path in a place where there is no point, a plus sign shows up, and that means that I'm going to be adding a point to this curve, right? And what it'll do is it's going to basically set the handles so that it makes sense between those 2 points. If I was to go to a point and hover over it when it already exists, like let's just say I'll take this one out, then it subtracts that point. And you're going to note that it will change the curve when you subtract the point. So I'm going to undo that subtraction, right? And so those are some of the other ways that you can work with the pen tool. If I create a path, so I'm going to go ahead and create a path here, that, and I want it to just be open like this, right? I don't want to complete it. What I need to do is I just hit the escape key. And when I hit the escape key, that's going to end that shape. Now, let's say I decide that I actually do want to continue drawing this path. What I can do is if I hover over either one of these endpoints, it goes to a slash symbol. And when I click on that point, it's going to allow me to continue it. Now note, because I clicked, it's a hard corner, right? If I was to hover over this and click drag, if I was to undo whatever I just did, if I was to click drag, you can see it did create a handle, right? But it's also this weird, right, result that's happening here. And we're going to look at that here in a second. I'm just going to finish that one off. And then I'm going to hit the letter V on the keyboard so I get the move tool. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Now, one of the things, like let's say I want to change the shape of this. Let's say I want this point, wherever it is, to actually have a hard corner. And I want to be able to move this up and make this more of like 2 humps that are closer in size to each other. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the shape. And you'll note that I don't have the ability to manipulate any of those points. For that, what I need to do is, instead of just using the selection tool, I'm going to use this white arrow, which is the direct selection tool. And if I use the direct selection tool, you'll see already all of the points are visible on here, which is maybe kind of hard to see against that magenta stroke. Let me go ahead and make that stroke. There we go. That should make it a little easier to see. And so now what I can do is, right now all the points are selected, but if I click on one of these points, you'll see that now any handle within the segment that that point is on is available. And I can also click on this anchor point and I can move, right, this point around. Then I can click on the handles and I can adjust the curve a little bit. If I rotate them a lot, right, I could really create some different geometry here. And again, I can also adjust the handles for the point that is the next point in the path, right? So both of these. Now, let's say with this, I want this to be a hard corner, right? But I don't want it to be like a sharp edge that drives up there. I'd like it to be able to still be able to be used as a curve. In order to do that, I can select this point here, and there's several tools that are available down here that are context specific, right? This changes no matter what tool you're using. And so what we want to do is we want to select this to a corner, right? So that's one option that we've got, is we can make this a hard corner, but then I don't have any handles I can adjust. One of the other things we can do is if we hold over the handle and hold the Option key down, you'll see we get this plus sign. And what that means is it's going to break this corner, which allows us to have this handle so we can control the shape of the curve, and this handle here, but they're going to be independently operated, right? We can use them together. You can kind of see how at this point I'm getting this crazy deep V out of this thing, which is a little bit problematic. I would prefer not to have that there. And we'll look at how to fix that in a second, right? But so yeah, so using the Option key allows you to break this, right? And be able to use that key separately. Okay. So let's say that we're happy with this shape, but the one issue is we have this like hard, like long arrow coming down here. So what we need to do is we need to go back to our selection tool, select the entire shape, and that's going to pull up all of our settings up here. And we can go to stroke at this point, and this is where some of these corners make a difference. So if I switch my join to round, you're going to note that this suddenly becomes a much softer corner than it was previously. If I do this, this bevel, you'll see that it truncates it more flatly. And really, right, it's going to depend on your geometry, on the shape you're working on. The other thing you can do with this miter join is you can adjust your limit. So if I set my limit to 1, right, that's basically going to make it into that miter shape. If I set my limit to 5, right, this arrow should be a little bit softer, but it might be too big. Let's set this limit to 2 and see what we get. So it looks like in this case, because this corner is so hard, it's going to have a little bit of a problem with setting these things up. And yeah, you can see, I don't know if 3 is going to work a little bit better. 3 kept it about the same. It looks like if I go up to, let's just do 20 and see what happens, right? So it doesn't really seem to make that much of a difference in this case. But it's one of the things that sometimes, depending on your curves, you can do to smooth things out. One of the other options, even if I leave this like this and set this back to the default of 10, one of the other things I should be able to do is go into my selection. And if I actually just do a little bit of rounding here, right, I'm going to get a similar result. It's really going to truncate some of that hard corner and make it a little bit more, more functional. Okay. Okay, so I want to show, let's see here. Let's go ahead and look at some other drawing tools, right? So we've started making all of these different shapes. So far, a good introduction to Illustrator, I hope. And so let's look at some other tools we can use to draw. So one of the other ones is the curvature tool. This is like the pen tool. However, it's a slightly different way of drawing. And again, this is something where what's nice is that there's a couple options. I also want you to note I have this object selected, and it's going to allow me to use the curvature tool to manipulate those points, which is pretty cool. We're not going to worry about that right now. We're going to draw something else with this. So if you click and then continue, right, what it's going to do is it's going to start curving that line based on where this next point's going to go, right? And so this tool can be pretty useful. depending on what types of shape you're looking to draw. And I'm going to go ahead and just finish this off. Because it does draw curved shapes very, very well. Again, you can, much like the pen tool, you can hover over a point, a place on the path here, and click to create a new point. If you hover over any point, right, that already exists, you can move that point around to adjust the shape of the curve, right? It's a really kind of nice, fluid tool that allows you to, right, continue to manipulate this based on that initial shape that you've been working on. And again, if I come over to this other shape, I'm going to need to use my selection tool first. So I'm going to hit the letter V. The shortcut for the, oh, never mind. We're just going to go ahead here. I'm going to go select this shape. Now we'll use the curvature tool, right? And so again, I can hover over these points, right? And I can do some manipulation here. You'll note that it does, right? It's going to, you know, change the shape of the path pretty substantially when you work with this tool because it's different than the pen tool. But again, now I could go back to the pen tool, and if I was to hit the letter, oh, by the way, the direct selection tool, the shortcut is A. So now if I select any of these points, I can manipulate them with the pen tool, right? So they work together, and you can do a lot of drawing with those. Okay, so some of the other tools that we've got here that are really useful, one of them is the paintbrush tool. Although let's do shapes first. So the shaper tool is something they created recently. What it does is if you draw a crappy triangle, it turns it into a triangle. If you draw a crappy circle, turns it into a circle. If you draw a crappy rectangle, turns it into a rectangle. If you draw other things, like let's say we make like an L shape here, ooh, that's going to be ugly. It doesn't do anything, all right? Let's try this again. And that's because those lines intersected in a weird way, right? So some of these more complex shapes it doesn't draw, I have no idea. I would never use this tool ever, right? It's there. I want you to know where it is. It actually tends to show up. And I'm just selecting these and hitting the delete key to delete those. However, it hides tools that are useful, like the pencil tool, the smooth tool, path eraser tool, and the join tool. So I have no interest in the shaper tool. It's not interesting to me. I typically either want the pencil or the smooth tool to be the one that's exposed. And we'll talk about why in a minute. So one of the other drawing tools is the paintbrush. So if I click on the paintbrush, what the paintbrush does is it basically allows me to draw a stroke. Now, this stroke right now is just a single black line, right? Because that is what the settings are set to. And so what I want to do, I do want you to note that this is, if I zoom in enough, you're going to see that it actually gets thinner here and thicker here, like a calligraphy brush. If I was to increase the size, the weight of the stroke, and I'm just going to go up to 11 points, and then do this, I want you to note that we are getting more of a painterly effect with this brush stroke, right? So this is, right, and that's just using this 3-point oval. I can use any of these brushes, right? And you can, well, if I zoom in maybe a little bit there, right? You can kind of see that as I draw this, I'm getting this type of a brush stroke. I'm going to go ahead and actually use my my selection tool to delete some of these, just because there's a lot of stuff on the screen. I might actually go ahead and get that out of the way. Oh, one of the things I really like about Illustrator, this is hilarious, is as long as you don't hit all the way over here, it won't jump back, but you can move stuff off the artboard while you're continuing to work on other things. So paths, and let's do this one actually because it's bigger, are just like any other object in that I can go to my direct selection tool. I could select any one of these points and I can manipulate the stroke that I just made. Right? I can come in here and if I'm like, oh, I don't want it to be black, I'd like it to be some other color as long as I have it selected, right? I can choose a different color for this stroke. In this case, black works fine for me. right? And the other thing to note is by default, when you're using the paintbrush, the fill is turned off. This box with a red slash through it means there's no fill, but I can always put a fill on there and it's going to work just like any other tool. So the paintbrush is really great for freehand drawing, and especially if you say you have a tablet or you're using an iPad as in sidecar mode or whatever, and you have a stylus, you can do hand drawing with this tool really effectively, right? The pen tool and the curvature tool are more precise and things that work a little bit better with a mouse, whereas the paintbrush tool definitely is something that works, that is intended to work well with a drawing tablet or some other means of drawing. Something else I forgot to mention earlier is you can hover over a path between 2 points when you're using the direct selection tool, and you'll get this little curve, and you can actually manipulate the curve that way too, which oftentimes makes more sense to people than grabbing the handles and using those. And that's something that's been more recently introduced. That's actually a really effective way to continue to work. Now, one of the things is that sometimes happens is, let's say you're using the paintbrush tool and you're trying to draw, a reasonably clean line, but you're a little jittery or you're using a mouse or a touchpad or something, and it isn't quite as smooth as you wanted it to be. Like, let's say that we wanted this to be much more rounded and not have any of those waves in there. That's where the smoothing tool comes in and is really effective. So if I use my selection tool, I select this, and I go to where the pencil is or where the shaper tool is, and I go down to the smooth tool. What I can do is, if I have this whole thing selected, I can choose to smooth the entire path. So if I go ahead and do this, you can see that this is going to smooth everything that I've done, It's going to be able to eliminate these things. But let's say that I like what's happening here. It's really just this zone that I want to deal with. So in that case, I'm going to zoom in and I'm just going to click and drag, and you'll see, that I get this path that shows up. And when I do that, what it's going to do is it's going to continue to smooth these areas out. And I should be able to, continue to manipulate this a little bit. And you'll note that this curve, even though I've tried smoothing it, is really not going anywhere. And that's where the pencil tool comes in and can be really effective. So if I come to my pencil tool, one of the things the pencil tool does is it allows you'll note it has an asterisk here, but it doesn't here. It allows you to essentially redraw the path freehand. So if I'm like, oh, well, what I really want, is more of a curve like this, then what that's going to do is it's going to move that curve around. Now, this is still a little bit sloppy in here, and I'd like to smooth that. So I'm going to go back to my smooth tool, and I'm just going to go ahead and click and drag to see if I can clean that up a little bit, which I did. And so this is one of the things I really love about Photoshop, about Illustrator as well, is that it has tools in place so that if you're drawing with a mouse or a trackpad or something, and it's not the highest fidelity work you can do, you still have ways to go back in and clean that up with relative ease. And nothing is really permanent at this point in Illustrator. Okay, so there's 2 other drawing tools that I want to introduce, and then we will be done with this tutorial. We'll save this file, and we'll talk about file format and all of that, and this tutorial will be done. So there's a couple other tools I want to show. First, there is, under the paintbrush, there's the blob brush tool. So the paintbrush tool paints strokes, It's just painting this edge. There's no fill turned on. You can turn fill on if you want to, but it's intended to be a stroke, There's people that do illustration in Illustrator, and they just draw a boatload of strokes, kind of like you're doing inking in a drawing. The blob brush draws shapes, but does it in a freehand way. This tool is incredibly useful for a number of use cases, and we're going to be using it in other tutorials as well. So the way that this works, is if I just start kind of scribbling over here somewhere, and I start drawing, instead of this, like if I was to draw this with the brush, what I'd get is this like crazy line. So let's go ahead and actually do something similar. So I'm going to take the paintbrush tool. I'm actually going to deselect that object. I'm going to grab my paintbrush tool. And in this case, let's see if it just switches. Okay, it does. Great. So if I want to change some of these settings, let's go ahead and make this like, I don't know, 20 points. So it's about the same size as the original brush. Right, if I was to do this same thing, more or less here, right, what that's going to do if I go back to my selection tools is, right, I just have this like crazy zigzag shape on top of each other. Whereas this is actually a solid filled shape, right? So with this solid filled shape, one of the cool things I can do is now I could add a stroke, right? So I can put a stroke around this blobby brush, and I can drop, granted, that doesn't look great. But if I was to say maybe change some of these settings here and actually have this aligned to the outside or something like that, right? I could get something where I've created, a really hand-drawn organic form, and I've put a stroke around the outside of it, right? Which is a pretty cool tool. And then there's one other thing, which is the eraser, right? There's some other tools down here we're not going to worry about right yet. But the eraser tool, what it does is it literally just erases the shape. So if I just click and drag, right, it's going to chop this into two pieces. Now, there's still one object, but it's just gotten rid of everything. And what's nice about it is it closes the path again, and makes it, set up. And then you can adjust the stroke weight as well. Right now it's set to 18 points. If I wanted this to be something smaller, I could set it to say 3 points. And because, of course, that is selected, let's go ahead and deselect that shape. And now if I set this to like 3 points and was to go back to my brush, or this brush, maybe this actually has a different setting. So for the setting for this, note that no matter what, it seems like it's stuck at this huge size, right? There's two ways I can adjust that. One is to use the opening and closing brackets. I can just tap the opening bracket to make it smaller, the closing bracket to make it bigger, right? So that's a pretty intuitive way. The other way I can adjust this is by double-clicking on this icon. And most tools will let you double-click to set things up. So if I double-click on this tool, you'll see I can adjust the angle, the roundness, and the size, right? In this case, we're just going to worry about the size. And I'm just going to make it, right, substantially smaller. I'm going to hit OK. And now if I go and erase something, you can see it's erasing something there. But let's go ahead and select this object, use the eraser, and see what we get if we actually erase a slot through there. So you can see I've erased it, but it's still not quite happening the way I'd like it to. Some shapes were doing weird things. That's something to just note with this tool is sometimes you have to get things down a little bit more. And if I was to actually go through and delete a bit more of this, eventually we'll get that gap. And you'll see I missed a little bit, and that's why that's there. I just need to erase it. And then again, right, if there's a little chunk there that I'm not happy with, I can always use the smooth tool to smooth that out some. I can do a little bit more cleanup. If that's not enough, I can use the pencil tool and I can just sort of draw a straight line through there and clean that shape up. Okay, so this is the introduction to Illustrator, to the very first things you can do so you can draw all of these different shapes. Something we haven't talked about that we'll cover in the next tutorial section is arranging things. I want you to note that the order in which you draw things is the order in which they layer on the page, and we're going to look at how to fix that in the next section. So let's go ahead and save this file, and then we're going to use this to just look through the next tutorial. It'll be a very quick tutorial about how to arrange things on a page. Okay, so we go up to Save File. We're going to save this, and when we save a file in Illustrator, the file type, I'm just going to go ahead and go here. The file type is an AI file. You can actually save directly as a PDF, an SVG, which is used for vector graphics online. And there's some other options there as well, but those are like the three main ones that you're going to be using. And I'm just going to call this Toot1. And note that right now it's asking, this is grayed out, which is great. We don't want to use the artboards anyway. We want all of this information here. So we're just going to hit save. And when we do that, we just want to leave all the things in the default setting and hit OK. Okay, now that we've saved it, this is the end of this tutorial. I will see you for the next one.